Greetings, I'm Tom Bengtson. Welcome to another BankBeat Conversations. My guest today is Bob Vogel. Bob is the chairman of New Market Bank, which is in the Twin Cities market. The New Market Bank is a family-owned bank. We're going to talk a little bit about family-owned institutions here in a moment. Bob, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. But I wanted to just get an opportunity to talk to you because I know obviously you have a bank, but you also have been very civically engaged, serving in the Minnesota House of Representatives, so we'll talk about that a little bit. But why don't we open up, just give us a little bit of background on your bank, tell us a little bit about the family history and so forth.
Okay. Well, my grandfather actually came out to work at the bank in 1912. Didn't really have much of the ownership because it was fairly widely held. Sometime, I believe it was in the 1950s, ended up buying controlling interest so that he could save his job because I think there were some investors from Minneapolis, St. Paul that could see there was going to be growth out there, and he wanted to keep his job. My dad joined him apparently for 6 months after coming home from military service because my grandfather had lost his employee. There was only 2 of them in the bank. Wow. Well, that turned into 75 years.
Amazing.
So that was a second generation. I graduated from St. Thomas in 73, worked in town for a few years, and then joined my dad in 75.
Okay.
Purchased his interest in 81 and opened a few branches and did a few things. And then in 2002, I believe it was, oldest daughter Anita joined the bank. Mm-hmm. And in 2014, we actually transitioned to her as president. Mm-hmm. So we're now in our 4th generation of family.
That's fabulous. You actually have 2 daughters at the bank, though, isn't that right?
Youngest daughter Karen joined, I believe, in 2005, mm-hmm. and is now heading up the marketing. Does a lot of the fill-in for helping with staffing and those type of things. So they complement each other well because Anita is a CPA. Mm-hmm. Karen is more of a marketing person, so between the 2 of them, it's a nice balanced approach.
And with the work that I've done in the banking world, usually we're writing about banks that have shareholder groups, some of them fairly large, but a family-owned bank, and there's plenty of them in the Upper Midwest, that's a different dynamic. And and I know you even were very involved in an institute that looked at issues that family-owned banks face. Just share with us some thoughts about what's unique about a family-owned bank and how you make decisions and how might that differ from a traditional bank held by a wide number of stockholders.
I hesitate to use the word legacy because that sounds as if you're just trying to keep something there because it's been there. But it kind of follows with that word because you look at it differently. I've never looked at a distribution or a dividend as my reason for running the bank. Made a decent salary, a decent living. We've lived the lifestyle we like. But it hasn't been about driven completely with ROA, ROE, and so forth, especially ROE, because you realize that you have this thing that's been there for multiple generations. It's a family business, and it has as much to do with proliferating and having a healthy family business as it is, to me, about getting a return on assets or a return on equity, which is necessary to keep it sound. But the soundness becomes more of a driving factor than the actual return to shareholders.
Mm-hmm. But when you're sitting around, I don't know if it's a board meeting or maybe it's an internal committee of some kind, and you're there, does everybody just defer to you, or maybe do you get a smaller vote? I don't know, but what is that like?
You know, youngest daughter Karen majored in entrepreneurship at St. Thomas, and they had a family business course, and you referred to the Family Held Bank Institute that we actually started. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, right in time for the recession, so we never really got the thing off the ground as we would have planned. But we did run a couple of cohorts, and a lot of that was about how do we as the outgoing generation transition to the incoming generation in time so that they have a chance to experience the same things we did. I was fortunate that my dad really kind of wanted to kind of semi-retire, at age 60. So he pretty much passed the torch to me in 1981, and I just took off with it. I haven't had that same desire to step away, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I shouldn't be transferring the authority, basically, for leadership to the next generation in time for them to experience what they need to keep this thing going. So we spend a lot of time on, yes, I have the experience, and you're always going to be recognized when you're there because of your longevity as kind of this figurehead. But by the same token, figuring out ways that we can transition this leadership to the next generation in time for them to experience as many things as I have, starting out with an ag, almost depression, moving into development things and everything else that's happened. And being able to manage through that, because it's the experiences, as probably most people know, of the bad times that teach you more about how you're supposed to run this thing than the good times.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. That's very interesting. The other thing that I know about your career that has always been interesting to me is you're very civically engaged, and I know you were on your county board, you were on your city council, I believe, and of course you were in the Minnesota State Legislature for 6 years. Talk a little bit about that experience. Is that something that you would encourage other bankers to think about doing? Was it a positive experience? Was it just frustrating?
You've described it well. It always had an interest in that, and where a lot of other people, have a passion for other things, whether it's golf or sports or whatever, I never really had that. So I always kind of move toward those type of activities. And actually started off when we opened the branch in Lakeville was my first real endeavor, which was with the Lakeville Chamber, and then being chair of their Economic Development Commission for a few years before the county commissioner thing appeared. So it just kind of happened, maybe as much because of my area of interest, but it also taught me so much about community and being in a growth area especially. I mean, when I went on the Economic Development Commission in Lakeville, population was probably 15, 20,000, and it was a city becoming now 75,000. So you started to learn about all of the aspects of growth and planning and everything else, which just kind of drew me in further to it. So I do think that we, as not only bankers, but to some extent a lot of times community leaders, need to allocate time to that, because it doesn't, you're right, the frustration turns people away from it. But the more we turn away from it, the more the frustration builds from people that don't necessarily always have the same commitment to the vision of the community as we do.
Well, I can imagine that when you're an elected official, people come from all spectrums of, all points in the spectrum of ideas, right? And they're coming to you and they're counting on you to represent them. And I'm sure that's got to be very challenging, and to sort through all that and decide what, is worthwhile and what isn't. It's got to be very tricky. And so I guess what my question is, does that experience of working through all these different options and figuring out how you're going to represent people, does that help you at all in your professional duties, like as a banker? Does it, you have to make loan decisions. That's a hard thing too. Is there any correlation or not?
There's a correlation because, first of all, it broadens your perspective, because you are talking to a plethora of different constituencies, if you will. And the other thing it's taught me, even though my kids wouldn't probably agree, is patience. Because I've learned that even though I think this is the way to go, it's not necessarily the only way to go, and it may not happen as quickly as what you think. So kind of a combination of understanding people better, but also having that wider vision on where do we go with things, and looking at things beyond the balance sheet. and seeing, okay, this is where we're positioned today. But if this is indeed where it's going, whether I like it to go there or not, and generally I have liked it to go there, then I have to have this vision of how am I going to position this entity for the longer term as well as just managing for today's return.
And of course, you have a business background. You understand balance sheets and income statements and so forth. So I would imagine those are very valuable skills over at the state legislature. Did you get the sense that your colleagues at the legislature appreciated that or counted on that or took it seriously? Or what was that like?
It's interesting because a lot of people in the legislature have a nickname. So the legislators have nicknames for other people.
Okay.
And mine was Banker Bob, the numbers guy.
Banker Bob, the numbers guy.
And-
Okay.
And I did find a quick acceptance of my skill set.
Okay.
Because, when we see this on TV, generally we see acrimony, we see arguments, we see all of this stuff. Not recognizing that there's a job there to be done. And the individual skill sets that people bring are respected. I happen to have a fairly unique one because there wasn't really another community banker in the legislature at the time I was. Probably almost going back, I don't want to miss anybody's name, but Roy Twilliger was probably a predecessor that had the same small bank, community bank experience I did. So it brings a different perspective, and I actually had people thank me for bringing that because it isn't something that's universally shared there at the legislature.
Sure. No, I'm sure that's correct. Yeah. And I'm thinking about the banking industry now, and it's very competitive and it's quite dynamic with the advent of technology. There's various regulatory pressures to bear. There's just a lot of things. If someone were to ask you, what are the key issues that bankers, community bankers, are working through at this time, what would you say about those?
I've been trying to bring a focus at the board, especially because that's where I belong now, on what is our balance sheet going to look like? We've come through a period of 15 years of not having to spend much attention on the liability side because when you think about it, the Fed's printing press has taken care of that for us. That press is now basically running out of ink because of a whole sort of issues. And we're going to have to, I believe, we're going to have to look at things differently because we've always had to manage the asset side. There were times when, through the past many decades, when the liability side was important as well. But that kind of faded. And I think there's almost a generation now of people that have never had to focus on that. So how are we going to fund that liability side to allow us to grow the asset side? Because it kind of took care of itself. I don't think it's going to in the future because I don't think that they can possibly do what's happened over the last 15 years.
Yeah. And it's amazing how dramatically and quickly that changed. Of course, during COVID and the pandemic and everything, there was all kinds of money out there, much of it finding its way into various banks. And so liquidity really wasn't a problem, but it's completely different. I mean, have you ever seen anything happen so quickly? I mean, you almost get whiplash thinking about it.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like this happen. Again, it doesn't surprise me when I look back because it went on and we got lulled into this for 15 years. And, and to some extent the asset side reflects that because I finally started buying mortgage-backed securities because it was the only place to hide. But the abruptness, I agree, it just, we are always expected to do the 300-400 basis point shocks up and down and so forth. And nobody really ever expected it to happen, but you knew that you had to do it. I'm not so sure that those tests came true anyway. But to some extent, I suppose if we look back, we'd probably see some dynamics that fit with it. But where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here?
Because,
That's a great question.
and that's where I come back to managing the liability side, I think, is going to be just as important as the asset side, because the asset side we're looking at asset quality basically. Where are we going to get the deposits? Where are we going to get the liabilities to grow?
Yeah, well, it's a question, of course, that bankers
That we never
everywhere are
faced
dealing
because,
with,
as
right?
you said, it came very abruptly.
Yeah, yeah. So you have recently gone on the board of directors for the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines. That is a source of liquidity in some situations. Of course, you've just been on that board for a few months, but what's your experience been so far, and what do you hope to achieve through your service on that board?
Well, first of all, I was always familiar with it. I had never really actively myself participated in the day-to-day operations of using it. Anita has been far more active with building the pledging and that type of thing. So as I explored what this thing is and what it does, I think what I bring is a perspective of the community bank. Many of the board members are from much larger institutions because there's only a few of us states, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri to some extent, in this home loan bank that have many small banks left.
Okay.
So I think I can bring the perspective there, as well as the real hands-on, because if you're in larger banks, the CEO role or the higher management roles are much more specific, whereas I've had to do everything. So my hope is that by being able to bring an understanding of that smaller bank, more broad-based, I can add a little bit of perspective there. The board, by the way, is very engaging, very accepting. I'm really excited about the opportunity to be there.
Sure.
Because it's going to be a whole new experience.
Well, it's such an interesting home loan bank in the sense that the district is enormous, based in Des Moines, but running all the way to Guam.
Exactly.
And of course, that's the result of the merger with another home loan bank a while back. But it's just got to be very unique. I can imagine sitting around that board table and you've got people from all over the place, and I'm sure they've got different experiences.
Well, and trying to understand it too. I mean, when I got to the legislature, there's a different process. I had to acclimate to seeing fiscal notes rounding off thousands. So when I saw 1,000, it was really a million. And so that came to me after a while. This, because of the complexity of how these things are done, and the charter is a government charter. It is not a typical corporate bank charter. So once the charter comes from is where your regulatory people come from. And it'll be interesting getting used to that different regulatory nature as well, because there is much more of a Washington, D.C. Federal Housing Finance Agency regulatory aspect than the prudential regulators we've had, such as the FDIC
Sure.
and the state, which probably tend to focus more on asset quality and capital than a Washington, D.C. regulator does.
Sure. Well, let's kind of wrap this up. I just want to ask you one more question having to do with independent banking. I mean, you were the president of, at the time it was called the Independent Community Bankers of Minnesota. It's called Bank in Minnesota now, but back in 98, 99, you were the chairman of that organization. I know you've been very active in community banking for decades. And I'm wondering, as we see the number of bank charters in general decline due to consolidation, and there's really no new banks starting up at any volume. What's your thought about the outlook for the industry? I mean, I suppose you have to be positive, but on the other hand, the realities are kind of jarring.
They are. We have some uniqueness left in Minnesota with a lot of smaller greater Minnesota communities. And I think that gives you hope that there's a reason for them being there and that they can be successful. My big thing, and we go back to the Family Held Bank Institute, is leadership. Because as you look at the incoming generations, where's that leadership going to come from? And especially if it's been in the family, and now you don't have children, that the next generation that are really looking at doing it. How do we keep it family or community owned for what might be just a generational transfer, because maybe the next generation has somebody? So putting in place the proper governance, the proper leadership, I think it's going to be as important as looking at the balance sheet and income statement, because that changes daily, yearly, whatever. But leadership and abilities and commitment to the entity itself, I think that's what we have to focus on. How do we keep people engaged, especially where there's still a purpose, but there may not be a desire to really dig in and work this thing.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that leadership. I mean, it's a great point to close on. Obviously, good leadership is really something that we need to value because it's a big deal. So I appreciate you mentioning that. So Bob Vogel, Chairman, New Market Bank, Elko New Market, Minnesota, Lakeville, South Metro here of the Twin Cities. Appreciate you being with us, sharing some of your thoughts. Thank you for being with us on this video, listening, and we invite you to join us again the next time we do a Conversations at BankBeat. Thank you very much.